G'day, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design. Welcome to the Router Bits. If you'd like to make some raised panel cabinet doors, there's a couple components you're going to need. You're going to have to make your stile first, which is your vertical piece, your rails, which are the horizontal piece, and then you're going to need to make a little raised panel that's going to slide inside of that. The router bit that I'm going to use to create the stile and the rails is just called a stile and rail jointing bit, and that does both the groove and this little tongued component. It's actually pretty similar to a tongue and groove jointing bit, it's just a little fancier. And then we're going to use a raised panel router bit. There's a number of different types of them to create this raised panel. Before you start setting the router up to cut any of those tongues and grooves, we need to make sure that all of our timber for our stiles and our rails and our centre panel have been cut to the correct size. And that's all going to be determined by the ultimate size that we want our cupboard door to end up at. Now my cupboard door is going to be 500 high by 350 wide. Our stiles actually go the full height of the cupboard, so they're just going to be a straight 500. And I've docked these off exactly at 500 out of some 64 by 19mm stock. So those are going to be our stiles. Our rails are actually going to sit within each stile. So in order to get to 350, we're going to start with 350, subtract the width of two of these, so 64 plus 64 is 128, but then we have to add back on the amount that these guys overlap. Now the groove in this tongue and groove is actually 9.65mm deep, and so two of them is 19.3mm. So our final size is going to be 350 less 128 plus 19.3, which brings us to 241mm.3, and that will get us an exact size overall of 500 high and 350mm wide. Now you're going to want to size your centre panel to make sure that it fits within those grooves and isn't pushing that frame apart, and I'll go through that once I've created the frame for you first. The way these little bits work is one of them cuts a groove on the inside of all of our pieces, our stiles and our rails, the whole way around. So you can imagine it doing that. It actually goes right to the ends of all pieces, and basically that groove, it accomplishes two things. It's what the actual panel is going to sit into, but it also allows us to join our rails onto our stiles by then doing a corresponding tongue bit on just the very ends of our rails. So the tongue component of this cutter only does a couple of small cuts, whereas the groove component does all four pieces to their full length. So first we're going to set up the groove cutter and at the correct height and depth, and we can run all four of these pieces through. I'm going to set up the groove cutting router bit first. We're going to set the depth and then of the bit, and then we're going to set the depth of the fence essentially. To set the depth of the bit, you've got to keep in mind that when cutting the groove, we're actually going to be cutting all of these rails and stiles with their faces down. So once they're all put together, if you have a really good face that you want to use with some nice feature, make sure that's facing downwards when we're cutting the grooves. And we want to make sure that we have left enough meat on the back side of the groove itself so that it's not super thin on the back of the groove and really thick on the front. Now the setting up of this is actually a bit arbitrary. You could do it at 4mm, 5mm, somewhere around there. It's arbitrary in the sense that it doesn't really matter how thick the back of that groove is. It just matters that the tongue and the groove match up perfectly. And we're going to use the groove once we've cut it to set the tongue anyway. So as long as they match each other, whether this is 4mm or 5mm deep into the timber, doesn't matter so much as long as you choose something that you can replicate. I want that to go a little bit deeper. That's sitting at exactly 4mm now, so I'll lock that off. And now I can bring my fence up to the router bit. So I'm just going to pull it forward. I'm going to use a ruler I'm going to set that on the bearing there, and then bring the fence to that so that it's flush. And that is going to run perfectly now. I've also just got to bring these little sacrificial sliders a little bit closer to the router bit. We're ready to do all of our cuts. Lay all of your rails and stiles out, making sure that you put the good face down, mark them, and so that you know what's going to be the inside and what's going to be the face. That way you don't get mixed up and you can keep it all lining up perfectly, especially if you've wanted to keep all of that, you know, the grain facing the same direction or something like that. We're going to run through one side of each piece, the rails and our stiles, facing down with our inside facing towards the bit, obviously, and then we're going to swap the bits over to cut the groove component just on the ends of our rails. Now that I've cut my rails and my stiles, we're ready to actually put the tongue cut on the ends of these rails. I need to change over the router bits, set up the height and stuff like I talked about before. That's what's happening now. I've swapped out our groove cutter to our tongue cutter now, so we're ready to set the height of that. Now we're going to use one of the pieces, this is our rail that we've already cut our groove in. We're going to use that to set the height of our tongue cutter. Basically all you need to do is line up the teeth with the remaining timber and make sure that they're perfectly in line. So I'm just going to drop that down. Now that that's lined up, that is going to be cutting our tongue exactly in the position we want it. And we just set the depth of the fence exactly the same way as before. Hold the ruler against the bearing, bring the fence up to that ruler and lock it off. Now that I've set the depth and the fence for this little tongue cutting bit, I'm ready to cut the tongues into my rails. Now one thing I found that makes this a lot easier is actually getting yourself a square piece of board. I've added a handle to this, but it's not terribly important. You can kind of create this any way you want as long as this edge is square. And I'm going to run that along my fence and hold my rail up against this piece as well as the fence. That means that instead of having to use my little miter sled, which sits in the groove, I can actually be constantly referencing my fence, which gives me the correct depth, instead of having to line up the distance from the fence to the groove exactly, which is actually kind of tricky. This way, it's actually pretty easy to hold there and move that through. Having the board behind it also acts a bit like a zero clearance cutting plate, so that you're not getting a whole bunch of tear out on the inside of these. When you are cutting your rails, as before, we're going to have the face down, and we're going to pass all four of those outside edges, 2 on this piece, 2 on the other piece. We're ready to do that cut now. Now that I've cut all 4 of those ends, I'm just going to clean up some of the little bits of fluffiness that are still left on those, and that's going to give me a really nice clean joint when I join them together. Usually it's just a matter of, for me, just cutting really gently along some of these feathers with a Stanley knife. It doesn't take very long at all. So now that we've done all of our cuts and they fit together beautifully, we're ready to create our panel for the center. You can do that in a number of ways. You could slide a piece of ply in there if it fit in perfectly, or MDF, some nice veneer. If you want to use the same 19mm timber to create a solid timber panel, then you're going to need to use a panel raising bit, a router bit. There's a couple of them, and we'll do another video on them describing the process of using a panel raising bit to fit a panel in this door. You can grab these stile and rail jointing bits from Timbecon either on their website at timbecon.com.au or at either of their stores in Perth and in Melbourne.